Hello and welcome to What's New in Aerospace. I'm Marty Kelsey, one of the hosts of STEM in 30, an Emmy-nominated TV show for students produced by the National Air and Space Museum. Before we get started into the show today, I want to take a minute to pay tribute to Michael Collins, who passed away yesterday. He flew on Gemini 10 and on Apollo 11. He was also the first director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. We got a chance to work with him a couple of years ago, and he was the nicest, most humble person you could ever meet. His vision and extraordinary achievements helped define our museum, and his wit, warmth, and wisdom will always be a part of our work. Godspeed. Today, we are talking about the 60th anniversary of American spaceflight, starting with Alan Shepard's launch through the Space Shuttle and all the way up to today, and even looking forward. Pretty much any question that you have about American spaceflight, our panelists can answer for you today. And that's where you come in. We want you to be involved in the show. First, let us know where you're watching from down in the comments section. We'll be giving shout outs throughout the program. And whatever questions you have, if it's about Mercury or Apollo or Gemini or the Space Shuttle or Dragon, let us know and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. And before we get started, let's bring in our guest. We're going to start with NASA's acting chief historian, Dr. Brian Odom. We've got NASA astronaut, veteran of 3 shuttle flights, Colonel Mike Mullane, the executive director of Harvard Business School Online, author and son of Mike Mullane, Patrick Mullane, and chief flight director at NASA, Holly Ridings. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
All right, so Brian, let's start with you. We've got the anniversary of Alan Shepard's flight coming up. Can you tell us about his flight and the reaction to it in the United States?
Oh my goodness. First off, thanks for having me here. I love the idea of we're going to cover 60 years of space flight in an hour. I think it's great. It's a challenge. I'm interested. But yeah, no, Shepard's flight, which started it for America, right? The first American space flight. The context of that obviously was the Cold War. Everybody knows the story of the space race. Everybody kind of knows what happened in April of, in April that year, a little bit earlier on, when Yuri Gagarin was able to orbit. So Shepard's flight was critically important. It proved out that the Mercury program, that America could respond. They could put an astronaut into space. Not quite the accomplishment of Gagarin's, but it was definitely a much needed response because it's critical to proving out that we're on the right path, that things are going okay. And it's really the flight that gives President Kennedy the confidence that he needs to move on to the next step. The question of where can we beat the Soviets, right? It's going to be to the moon. And after he gathers that information, it's Shepard's flight that gives him that motivation to get him over the hump that this is something we're going to do. I mean, I love these photos of Shepard. He's just such a classy kind of looking guy, right? He's the epitome of the Mercury 7. Somebody that had the intelligence and the ability and the fortitude to pull this off. So just an incredibly important performance by Shepard and set us on the goal for the next big step.
Awesome. Now, Mike, you grew up in seeing Shepard launch when you were a young man, and then you became an astronaut. Tell us a little bit about his influence and then you becoming an astronaut.
Well, his influence, in fact, even before that, with the Vanguard, Explorer, the early days of trying to get a satellite up there, I was 15 years old when this was occurring, and I was all in. I was consumed with the space race, and it set me on my path. I had a dream, like every kid did, of someday being an astronaut, but I knew that I was going to work in the space program somehow. My whole life was focused on that because of his mission.
All right, and Patrick, we see the amazing things that the astronauts do, and a lot of times we don't think about the human side of it, that backside. You grew up the son of an astronaut. What was that like?
It was interesting. It was cool in many ways. It was something that I don't think I realized was as unique as it was while I was living it. Like a lot of kids, I think you're just not, you don't have that wherewithal to be conscious of what it's like compared to everybody else's life. But it was exciting. It was fun. And as I often talk about, my dad's dream was mine because I idolized aviation, space travel. I was much like him, probably because of him. And, I often say that when he was selected as an astronaut, I think it was much of a dream come true for me as it was for him. I was kind of living vicariously through him and loved all that came with it, loved the community, loved being involved with NASA. and love seeing launches and being around other people who were involved in that.
Awesome. Holly, tell us about your role as a flight director and what's happening right now. It seems like Florida's a pretty busy place right now.
Yeah, so being a flight director is an amazing job, an amazing responsibility. We are responsible for all of NASA's human spaceflight operations. So, the International Space Station, commercial crew program, along with our partners, and then, Artemis. So putting the first woman and the next man on the moon here in just a few short years. And so the flight directors lead the teams, safety of the astronauts, the crew, the leadership of the mission, and then ultimately the success. And so, that's kind of a broad description of our responsibility. I am lucky enough to be the chief of that team and, have amazing flight directors, that work for me and execute all the missions across NASA's portfolio. And you said it's busy. From my standpoint, this is absolutely the busiest time in my career. Not only do we have the station, but again, the development of all the new programs. So it's really amazing.
Awesome. Well, let us know what questions you have. Again, anything for crewed spaceflight, let us know. Put it down in the comments section. We've got folks from Germany, the Ukraine, Netherlands, and Slovakia tuning in, as well as Texas, Arizona, Utah, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Oklahoma, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, California, Missouri, Nevada, and Indiana, as well as Sullivan's Island Elementary School in South Carolina tuning in. Thank you all so much for watching today, and let us know what questions that you all have. So Brian, talk to us a little bit about Shepard's flight and then what came next after that.
Yeah, sure. So that was the first step, but NASA began to unfold its larger plan, right? Apollo had already been in place, but the commitment hadn't been there. But Kennedy, after this flight from Shepard, he begins to say, okay, look, we're going to commit to this. We're going to commit to going to the moon. And everything from that point is all about making that a success. You move on, to the flight of John Glenn, for the first American in orbit. But then you move on quickly to the Gemini program. And the Gemini program was about learning to work in space, right? To rendezvous, to dock, and to do the things that you would need to do to go to the moon. And then the Apollo program, obviously all the work that goes into developing those big boosters that are associated with the Saturn program, Saturn 1, Saturn 1B, Saturn 5. So think about this, though. Alan Shepard's flight was aboard a delivery system of 78,000 pounds of thrust. By the time you get to the Saturn V, it's 7.5 million pounds of thrust. So just the gigantic technology leap it took to get from that to that, and the incredible amount of work that went into that across the country, it's phenomenal when you really think about all the things that have to go right. The Apollo mission did prove itself out, obviously, with Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Probably to some degree, most people see Apollo 8 as just as important, right? Because it was the first time humanity had gone beyond low Earth orbit, had gone to another realm, right? And so it's just one of the other things, Apollo 13, we were just on a panel talking to folks last night about the great movie Apollo 13. I'll plug there, but the things that have to go right, but when things go wrong, NASA's ability to respond and to build upon those lessons, I think, is critical. And I'd love to hear more from Holly about the things that go into operations today, and it's just so important that we don't forget these lessons of the past, right?
Yeah. So operations today, has a lot of history that's involved in the things you're describing, right? So we still have teams in mission control that we call them our flight control teams, are really operating from the ground. We have our crew members in space. And so a lot of what we do to put a mission together, you just think about timelines and crew procedures and the communication and the training. All of that really looks a lot like what they created in order, for us to learn how to fly in space, many years ago, back when Mike Collins was flying. And so certainly, the technology has improved and maybe looks a little different, but the fundamentals are very much the same.
By the way, speaking of that, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go for it.
I was just going to say one thing that reminiscing about times when Dad was going to orbit. One thing that you cared a lot about was who the flight director was. Now, fortunately, there were no slouches. I think everybody was good, but man, I mean, in all seriousness, I'm sure you'd agree, Dad. You have your loved one's life literally in their hands, with decision making, often with imperfect information that has to be made, and so. For what it's worth, I know you weren't there at the time, Holly, at least doing that job. But for all those that do it, thanks, because man, it was stressful at times.
I agree. There's every astronaut comes to have such faith in the launch control people, the mission control people, payload sim people. I tell people, when you're on a team and all of the people supporting you on that team, you can look left and right and see literally thousands of people that are supporting it, and know that each and every one of them carries that attitude. I have these astronauts' backs. I won't fail them. Whatever my part of this mission is, it will not fail. And frankly, that's the only reason you're able to swallow back the fear and climb aboard those rockets. I was scared, folks. When I got aboard those rockets, I was feared for my life. And I think most astronauts, if they were truthful, would say the same thing. It's hard to say that publicly. It's easy to do when you're retired, but when you're an active astronaut, I think you're a little close held with your emotions, and it's kind of, aw shucks, man, tweren't nothing when you're really, really scared out there. But you really do have such faith in mission control, launch control, all those folks. I admire all of them and salute all of them.
Now, Mike, Brian mentioned the size of the rockets. What's that ride like, sitting in the cockpit of the shuttle going up?
Okay, before I get into that, I did Brian once comment on that. Early in my life, back when I was a kid and watching this, the big thing was the lack of thrust of our rockets compared to the Russian rockets, and they were talking about weight was so critical. And I actually sat down as a kid and wrote a letter to NASA suggesting that instead of these heavy adults they're putting aboard, to get kids, teenage kids, to fly as astronauts. I wish I would have saved a copy of that. NASA didn't answer that, but they did send back a bunch of photos, which were pretty cool. But yeah, riding on top of the shuttle, when the engines start, you get a heavy vibration in the cockpit. Of course, you have there 1.5 million pounds of thrust from those liquid fueled engines being held to the pad by those hold down bolts. And then as soon as those blow and you're on your way, the vibrations go from a more higher frequency like this to a more bouncing around type of vibration. You get an immediate about 2 Gs, I think it's about 1.7 or 8 Gs as the rocket leaps off the launch pad when those boosters ignite. And those G-forces will decrease when the boosters separate. In fact, I remember when the boosters separated, there was such a drop off in the thrust, because each of those was given 3 million pounds of thrust. And when they burned out and separated, you sort of get a little light in your seat, even though the liquids are still running. But at that point, it's dead quiet. There was no vibration, no noise. The only way you could tell you're moving, besides look at the instruments, with the G-forces slowly rising in your body, and those ultimately stabilized at 3 Gs. But it was that dramatic drop in the noise and vibration at SRB SEP that scared me, frankly. I must have been asleep when somebody was describing that, because it took me by surprise at how dramatic it was. And I thought, oh my gosh, all the engines are shut off. But then I figured if that had happened, somebody would surely be saying something. I do remember leaning over to look at the 3 engine lights. If they go red, that means they're off. So I was happy to see that there were no red lights when I leaned over and looked. It was a great ride.
Awesome. Well, we've got people from Scotland, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Brazil, and Florida all tuning in. Let us know what questions you have down in the comments section, and keep those shout outs coming in. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Patrick, the next question we have coming in, I want to kind of pitch to you based on something that I read in your book. And if you haven't, Patrick's got a great book about growing up the son of a shuttle astronaut. Somebody wants to know, will we ever recapture the public excitement of the Apollo program? And then they said, or has that spaceship sailed? And in your book, you talked about after the Challenger accident, what the feelings were and how that kind of surprised you. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I remember. So first, let me describe that day for me, which was pretty interesting. I was a senior in high school in a history class when somebody came to the classroom and asked me out of the office. And it was clear she was crying. And she was a neighbor of mine, another student. And her name was Angela. And I kept saying, Angela, what's wrong? And she wouldn't tell me as she walked me to the office. Now, my dad was training for his next mission and had flown in NASA T-38s out to Los Alamos, New Mexico. And I immediately assumed he had been killed in a plane crash because, you fly in high performance airplanes. He'd been in the Air Force. I knew that could happen. And so I walked that 2-minute walk to the office, convinced my father had been killed and kind of trying to steel myself for the news. And it was a really bizarre mix of emotions when I got to the office and realized that what had happened was the principal had called the children of astronauts out of their class to let them know what had happened. And another point I make is, while obviously with Chris McCullough on the mission, there was a lot of attention with regard to school kids and certainly kids up in New Hampshire. In my high school, 3 of my classmates lost a parent that day, and 50% of the parents roughly worked at NASA. So it was really a traumatic experience. And I remember coming home that day. Dad flew back from Los Alamos right away. Our family gathered at home, and we were really concerned about what this meant. And it sounds a little selfish, but certainly as a kid, I thought, oh my gosh, would this mean Dad won't get to fly again? Number one. Number two, it would mean, well, I'll have to move. I'll have to switch a school. All the things a kid would think about. And we were surprised. I think Dad would agree that turning on the news that night, almost immediately there was this new national resolve around it. So I do think it still captures the imagination in some way. I actually think that if we've ever recaptured the imagination, it's happening now since Apollo, with everything that's happening with SLS, with Space Station, with SpaceX, with all of the private space ventures. I think that you couldn't ask for a better time to be alive when it comes to space travel.
Holly, have you seen an increase in enthusiasm for space travel over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I actually very much agree, with Patrick. When Bob and Doug launched, so last May, not quite a year ago, and then they landed in August. That was the Demo 2 mission, so demonstrating with our SpaceX partners, their ability to get crew to the International Space Station. And we just then this last week launched Crew 2, and are planning on Crew 1 coming home, right? So there's the Crew 2 picture. I was lucky enough to be in Florida and watch that launch. If you haven't seen the footage, it was a night launch, absolutely amazing. And so, back to the excitement and the interest, I was in mission control here in Houston for the Demo 2 mission last May, and the PAO person's 2 consoles down, and, counting the live stream, and, 10 million people were watching. Just millions and millions of people were live streaming. And so, when you consider everything that's going on in the commercial industry outside of human spaceflight, when you consider a human spaceflight, both in low Earth orbit, and now really the push to get back out of low Earth orbit, I absolutely agree.
Awesome. And oh, go ahead.
Oh, Holly, I have a question for you. And that is, do you know the trajectory of the reentry of the Crew 1 Dragon across the U.S.? I saw a shuttle one time reentering over New Mexico and walked outside my house to watch it. And it was the most spectacular thing to see the shuttle at maximum aerodynamic heating. It was just this incandescent white dot trailing this horizon to horizon trail of ionized gas that the sun was hitting. It was just because it was still dark on Earth and light up there. It was so beautiful, and I'd love to see that with Dragon. Do you know whether it's coming over the Southwest, or is it coming up Central America, or how's that working?
So actually, my meeting right after this is to talk about that. A lot of it's dependent on the weather, as you guys will remember, from Shuttle and even back in Apollo. And so SpaceX has landing opportunities in the ocean, both on the Gulf side of Florida and the South, and also on the Atlantic side. And so right after this, we're talking about the weather, and then, pick that ascending or descending node in our terminology, right? So, if you kind of looking at the US, you'd be in the kind of upper left down to the far right, Florida, or you do it, sort of the opposite way in a X that's ascending and descending. So right now I can't tell you, but we should know probably by the end of the day, as soon as I'm done talking to you guys, and then go and do that work.
Well, I hope it comes over the Southwest area, because it is incredible to watch that. And anybody in the country or the world for that matter, well, I guess it would probably be over the U.S. and Canada that would have the best chance, but it is spectacular to see a reentering space object.
I actually got a chance to see the Crew 2 launch from my front yard. I took my kids out, woke them up early, went out there, and was able to see it. And of course, I'm standing there as the dad. Look at that! There it goes! And my son was super into it. My daughter's like, yeah, there it is.
Yeah,
there are people on board.
Yeah, we were able to take our son, actually, who's 9, and I mean, it was, I'm listening to Patrick and like sort of channeling that. Obviously, I'm not an astronaut, but he sort of has a little bit the same life, right? Very involved, jumping up in the stands, screaming and yelling. So,
and if you're watching and you get a chance to see a launch or to see a capsule coming back in for reentry, or even just seeing the space station passing over, it's absolutely amazing. And we'll put in the links on Facebook, a link to a video on how you can spot the station from where you live. You can look up the passes and see that. And once you see it pass over, it is something that you're going to want to go back out and see again. We've got people from Sweden and Georgia tuning in, and we've got a lot of questions. Keep those questions coming in. We've got a few more minutes here. We've got an AP teacher at Indiana Academy in Muncie. What can high school students do to give themselves a head start toward getting involved in the space program? Mike, let's start with you.
Well, STEM is obviously should be their focus in school. You're not going to be able to participate in the space program much, either as an astronaut or even as a flight director and some of these other positions without having a strong background in STEM. So focus on that early in your years there and continue it through your education. But as I say that, I do want to emphasize you've got to be able to communicate. So English, writing, speaking, it doesn't matter if you're a brainiac with numbers. Well, it does matter, but you have to be able to communicate too. And another thing is get involved with teams. NASA is one gigantic team that we all depend on each other. We're all from diverse backgrounds, a lot of diversity in NASA, and we're all pulling together for one objective, whatever that mission is. So get involved with teams to get those great team skills that you need and learn how to be an inspiring team leader. Those are the things that I would suggest for any young student thinking about coming into NASA.
Holly, how does somebody come work with you?
Yeah, so my answer to that question for high school students is always be willing to go and do things you're not good at, right? So most really accomplished people really like to be accomplished, and one of the most important skills is learning how to be uncomfortable and still figure out something that you don't know anything about. And so even as a high school student, you can find projects, sort of tackle that issue of, hey, I might not be very good at that, and learn how to deal with it, because spaceflight is challenges every day that you don't anticipate. And so you have to stay open-minded, you have to be able to have creative thoughts. And so to me, you can start that process of learning that skill, really young. The other one is always take on the jobs nobody wants. Again, everyone wants to be noticed, but go find something where you're just going to do it and do it well, and no one's going to notice, because a lot of flying in space is just that. Like, every single detail has to be perfect. Flight directors are lucky we sit in mission control and people recognize us. And astronauts are lucky they fly and people recognize them. But there are thousands and thousands of people who have to get it right, and you have to be okay with that.
And Patrick, you had some early interests, obviously, in space and aviation. And can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you did early on, as far as like flying gliders and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I channeled my passion like a lot of kids interested in aviation. I made model airplanes. I flew remote control airplanes. And it was kind of cool. In fact, my remote control flying days, we were often, there I am, looking at my short shorts and tube socks. But this was out at, actually, this probably wasn't at JSC. I had a motorized one I flew at JSC. And it was kind of cool because often, particularly Hugh Gibson, who was a big maker of pretty intricate RC airplanes, would be out there flying. So again, I got to enjoy aviation, but I got to hang out with astronauts while I did it, which I always thought was kind of cool as a kid. And I think you have another picture actually that's really related to something Holly said. You talk about doing something out of your comfort zone. I went to Clear Lake High School, which is probably not far from where you live, I imagine, Holly. And I was a male cheerleader in Texas in the 80s, which was not a very common thing at all. And boy, did I take some abuse. But you talk about stretching yourself into something. There I am. Talk about stretching yourself into something that's outside your comfort zone. And I say it tongue in cheek, but there is a serious lesson here, which is quite literally a lot of what happened to me after this. I attribute to this because I was in a large high school, kind of a nerd, as you could see from those other pictures, wasn't well known. I did something unusual and everybody knew me. And then I got elected class president. And I'm sure that had a lot to do with me getting an ROTC scholarship, which paid for me to go to college where I wanted to go and led to leadership opportunities later. And I ended up going to Harvard Business School after that. And I know it sounds corny to say it, but I think it all started with kind of that decision to do something different and try leadership in a realm that was unusual and stretch myself. And it really made a difference. So I endorse what Holly said there. I'm not suggesting everybody do exactly that, but it worked.
Yeah, and I would say, from a liberal arts guy, right?
Yeah.
I'm a historian, right? So there is a place for everyone who's strong at what they're great at NASA, and you will find you will fit in at some point, and you will contribute in a way that's incredibly valuable. Find what your interest is, find out what drives you, and if you're interested in working at NASA, there's a place for intelligent, committed people. But I think just to go back again and just to reiterate what Holly's saying. Know your strengths, but you've got to stretch and you've got to be willing to learn something, take on a challenge, something that, that you find that maybe it's not your strength. Take it on, take the job nobody wants to do and knock it out of the park. If you've got that, you're ready to work at NASA right now and you just need the experience.
And by the way, Brian, my sister, my younger sister, who is the most liberal arts person of liberal arts people in the world. She was majored in theater for a while in college. She's actually in the communications office at Los Alamos Labs talking to reporters about landing on Mars. So to your point, there's opportunity everywhere.
And next week, STEM in 30 releases a brand new episode. It is all about careers. And we've got Victor Glover talking about how he worked at a 7-Eleven before he became an astronaut, and he's in space. And Holly, he comes back tomorrow, correct?
Yeah, right now, again, weather dependent, right? But the landing is on Saturday about 10-ish in the morning, 10:30 Central Daylight Time. So they leave the space station tomorrow and then land on Saturday. Awesome.
So anything that you're passionate about can definitely lead to a career, whether it be at NASA or just a fulfilling career, or you can come work with me at the National Air and Space Museum. We've got a few more minutes left in the live chat today. We've got more questions coming in, and Mike and Holly, I want to ask both of you. You all have a lot of training to be an astronaut and a flight director. Are there things that they don't train you for that come up, and how do you deal with those things that you're not trained for? Holly, let's start with you.
Okay, training is very technical, right? So, again, procedures, systems, communication, avionics, power, propulsion. I'd say that certainly for engineers, the thing that you have to remember to focus on is the human aspect. And so, so earlier Mike mentioned this, the communications. Engineers are not necessarily known widely for their communication. And so as we continue to grow the world of human spaceflight, it was always a team effort. Now it's a far-flung, geographically, culturally diverse team effort. And so really putting some time and energy into understanding, the cultural differences, the differences in priorities, whether you're commercial or whether you're government, and the human aspect. There's an emotional component to human spaceflight. That's what makes everyone love it. And really being able to understand that part along with, your technical truth and the safety and the risk assessment that you do. So, you start focused on the technical side, but you end up, the more balanced you are with sort of both halves of that, I think the better off you are from being able to lead. So Mike.
Well, I was, thinking about that question about being prepared for surprises, and NASA is world-class at training. I was astounded at how thorough they were. They have the attitude, the philosophy is, we're going to train these astronauts so they're never surprised. And then they say, but they will be surprised. And that's true. That's the attitude that NASA has in their training program. And because of the stress that they put us under in these training simulations, you'll launch on a shuttle, a simulated shuttle launch there at Houston in the sims. You'll launch a couple seconds up, you'll lose an engine, you'll have a cabin pressure leak, maybe a hydraulic leak. they're just bang, bang, bang. And mission control is integrated on some of these sims. So they're seeing this and they're having to react to it. And it drives you into a level of detail in the various systems that you really will probably never need, but having that background makes it easier to address these surprises when they do appear. Well, I'll give you an example. On my STS-27 mission, the tip of the right side solid rocket booster broke off and shotgunned our heat shield. The ground was aware of that. Mission control was aware of that. And they sent up the instructions to me as a robot arm operator to maneuver this arm that has a camera on the end of it so we could survey the damaged area and see what that looked like. And we hadn't trained for that, to use the arm like that at these crazy angles. But because everybody knew the systems in depth so much that they were able to come up with the procedures and send it up to me. So it is really a great training philosophy. No surprises, train so there's no surprises, but knowing there will be surprises. So NASA's world class. I don't think there's a team anywhere in the world that does it better with training than NASA does.
Brian?
Yeah, and even the fictionalization associated with the Apollo 13 movie, though, right? But that gives you some insight. It didn't happen quite like that, but it gives you some insight into just what you're saying, Mike. You know, like we want to learn nominal, but we also want to learn all of these other contingencies that happen. So when it happens, we at least have some framework for understanding and working the problem, as they say. But it's, you know, it's also for operations as well. You know, when you're thinking in terms of the Hubble Space Telescope, Chandra X-ray Observatory, the upcoming launch of James Webb Telescope, you know, understanding everything that can happen, understanding how you would respond to it, and having that training basically become like muscle memory almost, and then you can respond to it. You're exactly right. You know, looking at NASA's history, NASA is characterized by its ability to respond to that, whether it's, you know, combustion instability in an F1 engine and working a problem that way, or if it's understanding what might happen to make Hubble serviceable to interact with that. So it's incredibly interesting.
Yeah, and if I could, you know, a large part of my job is to really continue that culture, right? We have our foundations of flight operations, you know, discipline, competence, teamwork, but part of it says, you know, to be aware that suddenly and unexpectedly, you could have to make a decision that has ultimate consequences. And so, you know, that speaks to the ability to, you know, to be creative and to solve problems. And it's interesting, people that do well here, they like problems. And so if something goes wrong in mission control, people just show up. Like, you don't have to call and ask them to come. Everyone just comes and, you know, what can I do? How do I help? You know, what do we need to solve the problem? It's a pretty phenomenal, you know, group of people that are willing to do that.
I was going to make one other comment on the simulation, how thorough it is. I must have sat in hundreds of simulated launches on the shuttle, and there were only two of them that were actually nominal, where everything went the way it was supposed to. The very first time we got in the sim, they gave us a look at, this is the way it's supposed to work, from liftoff, engine start, all the way to orbit. That was the last one we saw nominal for many, many years, because now it was all Armageddon, failure after failure after failure. And then the only other time I saw a nominal sim was before the last time we were in the sim, before leaving NASA to go fly a mission. The sim instructor let us see what a nominal flight was going to be like, hoping that that's what we would see. But one before every mission, so there's three there, and then the one at the very beginning was the only nominal sims I ever saw. The rest of them were all high stress.
Patrick, as a family member watching a launch, you didn't have training on how to deal with things, and there was one that was kind of scary, right?
Yeah, STS-41D, which was the first flight of Discovery, had a pad abort, and this had never happened in the history of the shuttle program, and so there was no reason to think you knew what was going to happen there. We were fortunate; we have astronauts as family escorts that help us decipher what's going on. But that was actually one instance where I will say, and I talked about this in my book, one thing that made me very nervous was mission control, or launch control in this case, seemed confused and surprised. You could kind of hear it on the communication, and that was a little disconcerting because that's not what NASA does, right? You had this sense. So Initially, they were confused. Then that abated because I think they were getting a handle on things. But then it got tense again because there was a fire at the base of the pad, which we could see on closed-circuit televisions in the launch control director's office where we made our home during the moments after launch. And then lastly, the thing that was terrifying about it was while we saw this, it was a very foggy day, and we saw a flash of light through the fog as the main engines ignited, but then they shut down. And we all kind of dropped our heads in disappointment and worry. And then we heard what we thought was an explosion. And it didn't occur to us. I mean, the physics of this, even though it should have been obvious, was since we're 3 miles away, it takes sound about 15 seconds or so to get to you. So what we were hearing was those engines that ignited 15 seconds before, but it sounded like an explosion. So we all looked to the launch pad, and somebody had yelled out, "No, that's a sound, from moments earlier." So yeah, it's tense. In some ways, I think it's a little worse for the families. I don't want to speak because I'm not sitting on the rocket, but there's something about you don't have any control over anything. Not that you do if you're sitting on it, but maybe you feel like you do a little bit. And secondly, to some extent, Dad signed up for it, whether we wanted to or not. We were along for the ride. Now, fortunately, in our family, I think we were all supportive. But I imagine there are times when that's not true. I've never heard anybody say that, but it's got to be true given the number of families that have been involved.
Now, Mike, the question, just a little bit, were you disappointed that you didn't get to ride the escape system on the shuttle?
Well, not only you talk about the pad escape system, that basket. Well, let me put it this way. I just soon never have to ride it because that means you have to get away from something in a hurry. We did think that we were going to have to do that. There's a basket, or 6 of them, I think, to accommodate everybody, but they're on a 1/4 mile long wire that is up at the cockpit level. So in the event you had to escape from the launch pad, you have to be able to get out of the hatch yourself, unstrap, get out of the rocket yourself, run across the access arm, which will have been swung back into position, jump in these baskets, release them, and then they slide a 1/4 mile down and are caught by a net. And then you jump out and you hide in an underground bunker to wait out whatever the problem is on the launch pad. We did not have to do that, but we did think we were gonna do it because of hearing that word fire, and we could see all the water being deluged up over the vehicle. And so obvious to us that they were trying to put out this fire in a hurry. So we unstrapped from our seats, and Judy was downstairs, and she was going to be the one to open the side hatch, and we'd be all running out of that. As it was, though, our launch control told us to sit tight. They saw they were making progress in getting the fire out, so we remained in the cockpit, and they came out and extracted us the normal way. But it was very tense in the cockpit, no question about that. When that word fire was mentioned, that gets your attention when you're on 4 million pounds of propellant.
We've got just a few minutes left, and I want to talk, and Brian, I want to start with you. Can you briefly tell us about the makeup of those early astronauts, the Mercury and Gemini astronauts, and then we're going to kind of talk about how that changed with the shuttle program and then today. So, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, the culture at the time of the first Mercury selection, the Mercury 7, these are all test pilots. They're all, white males, very much, not a lot of diversity there. But I mean, there's a particular breed of person that they found. And so these folks were incredibly, passionate about what they did. They'd proven themselves to have that experience. But one of the things that we benefited from moving forward, and obviously the class in 1978 was a key piece of that, right? The introduction of diversity into the staff, because one thing at NASA that you will find too when you're talking about the makeup of who makes up the workforce. Every time you have multiple perspectives, and every time you listen to those perspectives and take them into consideration, you learn a lot. And at NASA, you're dealing with very complex problems that really haven't been encountered at any level. So you need those voices in the room. You need those multiple perspectives. And so from the shuttle program forward, you do see that those multiple perspectives coming in, and you do see the increase of diversity. Obviously, Sally Ride, Ron McNair, Fred Gregory, Guy Bluford, Mae Jameson, we could go into, all of that was changing at that time for the shuttle program. But now you look at the Artemis class and the Artemis generation of astronauts, and you see that diversity as well. I mean, the fact that, Jeanette Epps and folks and the the Artemis, the first mission to land humans on, the next mission to land humans on the moon, you're going to have that first woman there. You're going to have that first person of color, so you're seeing this reflected in the program, but that speaks to NASA's internal mechanisms as well, right? This is the way we solve problems.
Mike and Patrick, you were both very close with Judy Resnick. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Well, yeah, she was the second American woman in space. We flew our rookie mission on STS-41D, and you're not crewed with anybody unless you really get to know people and get to be very close friends. So yes, she was a very close friend, wonderful lady, brilliant electrical engineer, accomplished pianist. She was just really a whole package, and loved being around her and working with her and the rest of the crew. And it was just heart-wrenching when she was lost on Challenger.
Yeah, and I mean, as a kid, I remember thinking and getting to the point of how big a leap it was at the time for NASA, no pun intended, with respect to the more diverse class. Is that I grew up in an aviation community that was all male for sure, mostly white, given Dad's experience in the Air Force up to that point. So it was almost exotic to me, the idea that women were involved in the space program, and I noticed it then, and then looking at the class in the TFNGs in 1978 was for the time a very, very diverse class. It wouldn't pass muster, I think, today as being diverse, but it certainly was back then. One thing I will say, by the way, on this point, given that I do work at a business school, is there's a lot of data to support what you all were just talking about with respect to diversity of teams. A lot of faculty here have done research on this very topic and find that companies and organizations in general perform better when they've got a lot more diversity in their boards and in their management structure. So, what's true in the business world obviously is going to be true in the exploration world too.
And Holly, talk to us a little bit about your team and the current group of astronauts.
Yeah, so NASA has, as we've talked about, an amazing culture, a deep belief in diversity of thought, right? So I always think about it in two parts. One is technical diversity, right? Somebody whose background is rockets, is spaceships, is recovery, is history, and you put them all together and you get really good technical answers. But the other part of that is diversity of those individuals, their backgrounds, how they look, where they're from, how they think. And again, everyone brings a different perspective. And then that allows, your team to really coalesce around an answer that is typically very strong. One of the things we haven't touched on, which is a little bit unusual, is the pandemic. But I do think that NASA's diversity in all ways and its strong culture has allowed us to, just continue over this last year and fly Bob and Doug and get the crew the guys for, the crew that's coming home up and then hopefully down soon, get the crew 2 launched, make a lot of progress towards, Artemis 1, hopefully later this year. And space station, it's just such a huge list that we've accomplished in this last year. And without the individual strengths and all the different perspectives, I'm not sure we would have been able to do that and make as much progress and carry on in such a positive way.
Awesome. Well, I want to remind everybody watching that the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, reopens on May 5th, and newly on display, the first time you can see this at the Udvar-Hazy Center, will be Freedom 7, Alan Shepard's capsule that he flew. Brian, can you talk a little bit about what people will see, what they're looking at when they see that capsule?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think you'll be struck by is the people who've been following what's happening lately with the Crew Dragon and what we're dealing with now versus what we were then. It also holds up well, but you really do worry about what Alan Shepard and those guys were thinking climbing into this thing, right? You see the images coming back now from crews going to ISS, and you're just like, wow. That looks like the sweetest ride ever, right? But those Mercury capsules were incredibly cutting edge for the day, right? They were light, they were efficient, they were aerodynamic, they held together, they served the purpose. You look at on the interior of that, you can see that that was cutting edge. That was cutting edge technology for the day that not many people have. The comparison there, I would say, compared to what Yuri Gagarin was in, during his mission versus what Shepard got to ride in, and I think you'll see a kind of a dichotomy emerge there. But I think it is impressive to look at that and to think about how far we've came, right? But from then to now, and it's incredible, and the amount of work and technology. And why is it that NASA? What's the benefit that humanity has from what NASA does? And I think of it in terms of paradigm shifts and how we think about technology. I mean, I don't want to go off the rails on it, but the world you entered 1958 with, when NASA was created, to the world we're living in now in terms of technology, the phone in your pocket. It's NASA is involved in every step in that in some way of just what is the next step, because space is so hard and you need such complex answers to pull that off, and it takes these great leaps of technology. So I think so. The Friendship 7 capsule, I think you can look at it and it speaks to that progress of where we were, where we are.
And Mike, just a few steps away is Space Shuttle Discovery. Real quickly, do you have a favorite memory of Discovery?
Well, just the new car smell when you got in the cockpit. It was wonderful to be able to fly the very first flight of one of these orbiters. It was everything was sparkling new, and as you would expect. Well, actually, they keep all of them real clean, obviously, but it just had this feeling that, hey, this is the first time this machine is going to fly, and we're going to be in it. It was just such a proud moment to be able to participate in that. And there's every moment in Discovery is a memorable moment, and I'm glad that I was able to experience it.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. Thank you all so much for joining us and for everybody tuning in. We really appreciate it. I do want to remind everybody that if you missed any parts of today's program or any of our previous programs, you can head on to the archives either on the STEM in 30 Facebook page or the National Air and Space Museum's YouTube channel, and you can catch up on all of the live chats that we've done. The latest episode of STEM in 30 came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's on the 40th anniversary of the Space Shuttle. It looks at the history of the shuttle, the people who flew it, and even has some hands-on experiments that you can try at home. Next week, we have a brand new episode coming out all about careers, and as I mentioned earlier, it goes into some of the early jobs of working at Target and even 7-Eleven for astronauts and engineers. And you get to meet a whole bunch of incredibly cool people on that episode, including Ginger Z, the chief meteorologist at ABC News, as well as Dean Kamen, the founder of FIRST. We hope you can tune in on there. And if you like this program, be sure to give us a follow on Facebook and on Twitter, and subscribe to the National Air and Space Museum's YouTube channel. Brian, Patrick, Mike, and Holly, thank you all so much for joining us today, and thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.